Let me begin with a confession. I don't like the word intelligence very much. People treat it like a trophy. They polish it, display it, compare it. They argue about who has more of it, who has less, who was born with it, who wasted it. Entire industries are built around measuring it with little numbers and tidy charts. But the trouble is, intelligence isn't a thing you can scoop into a jar and weigh. It's not height. It's not horsepower. It's a process. And whenever humans take a process and turn it into a label, we get into trouble. So if you're here hoping to find out whether you're smart or not smart, you're already asking the wrong question. Physics taught me this lesson early. The most dangerous words in science are, "I already understand that." The moment you think intelligence is something you have, instead of something you do, learning stops. What I want to talk about instead is depth of understanding, how people engage with ideas, problems, and reality itself, not better or worse. Not higher or lower as people, but deeper or shallower ways of thinking. So I'll offer you 7 levels, not as a ladder, not as a ranking system. Think of them as lenses. You may use different ones in different situations. Everyone does. The question isn't where do you stand. The question is, how far are you willing to go? People confuse intelligence with speed, how fast you answer. Or memory, how much you can recall. Or credentials, how many certificates you've collected. But those are surface effects. I've met people who could calculate faster than anyone in the room and understand absolutely nothing about what they were doing. I've also met people who struggled with equations but asked questions so sharp they cut straight to the heart of a problem. Intelligence is not about being right. It's about how you deal with being wrong. That's why any honest discussion of intelligence must include humility, curiosity, and the willingness to say 3 very powerful words. I don't know. With that in mind, let's explore 7 different levels, not as judgments, but as mirrors. Level 1, recognition without understanding. Let's start with the most common level, because almost everyone lives here at least some of the time, and there's nothing shameful about that. At level 1, intelligence looks like recognition. You recognize words, phrases, and ideas. You've heard them before. They sound familiar. You know roughly where they belong. If someone mentions artificial intelligence, quantum physics, inflation, or cognitive bias, you feel a little nod go off in your head. Ah, yes, that thing. But here's the important part. Recognition is not understanding. It's knowing the label, not the mechanism. Now, that doesn't mean level 1 is useless. In fact, it's necessary. You can't understand something deeply without first recognizing that it exists. But trouble begins when recognition masquerades as comprehension. A real-world analogy makes this clear. Imagine walking through a foreign city where you don't speak the language. You recognize the logos of familiar brands, the shape of a hospital sign, the red octagon that means stop. You can get by. But if someone asks you for directions or explains a local custom, you're stuck. The symbols are familiar, but the meaning behind them is missing. That's level 1 intelligence. Here's a short thought experiment. Suppose I ask you, what is electricity? You might say, it's the flow of electrons. That sounds right. It is right, in a sense. But now suppose I ask, what does flow mean here? Or, why do electrons move at all? Or, what happens inside the wire? Very quickly, many people run out of ground. They recognize the phrase, but they never opened it up to see what was inside. I've seen this happen constantly. Students and adults use impressive words fluently, not to deceive others, but to reassure themselves. The vocabulary becomes a shield. If you can name it, you feel like you know it. This is where false confidence begins. Level 1 intelligence becomes dangerous only when we stop there and say, that's enough, when recognition gives us the illusion of mastery. So here's the reflective question I want to leave you with. When you say, "I know that," could you explain it to someone using completely different words, without jargon, without borrowed phrases, starting from scratch? If not, that's not a failure. It's an invitation. Because intelligence doesn't begin with knowing the answer. It begins with noticing that you don't yet understand the question. Level 2, memorization and repetition. At level 2, intelligence starts to look impressive. This is the level most schools reward, most exams measure, and most people quietly mistake for real understanding. Here, you don't just recognize ideas, you can repeat them. You know the official definitions. You can quote authorities. You've learned the correct sentences, and you know when to say them. And to be fair, this is progress. Memorization is not useless. You can't reason about something you've never encountered. Facts matter. Vocabulary matters. But memorization is like scaffolding. It helps you build, but it's not the building itself. The danger appears when repetition replaces thinking. Let me give you a simple analogy. Imagine learning to cook by memorizing recipes word for word. You know that step 3 says simmer for 10 minutes, and step 5 says add salt to taste, but you don't know what simmering actually does or why salt changes flavor. The moment the stove behaves differently, or you're missing an ingredient, the recipe collapses, and so do you. That's level 2 intelligence. You can perform under familiar conditions, but understanding hasn't taken root. Here's a short story that illustrates this beautifully. I once met students who could solve long chains of equations perfectly. They were fast, efficient, confident. But when I asked a simple question, "What does this equation mean physically?" they froze. Not because they were unintelligent, but because meaning had never been required. They had memorized the dance steps without hearing the music. This level is seductive because it provides quick rewards. You sound knowledgeable. You get good grades. People nod when you speak. And if no one asks deeper questions, you may never notice the gap. But physics and life has a nasty habit of changing the problem. A small shift in context and memorized knowledge fails spectacularly. That's when frustration appears. People say, "I used to be good at this," when what they really mean is, "I was good at repeating what I was taught." Now let me offer a thought experiment. Suppose tomorrow all textbooks vanished. No formulas, no definitions, no slides, just you, a problem and reality. Could you reconstruct the idea from basic principles? Could you reason your way forward? If the answer is no, that's not a condemnation. It's a sign you're still at level 2 and that there's more to enjoy ahead. So here's the reflective question for you. When you explain something, are you repeating words you've learned, or are you generating the explanation yourself? The difference matters, because intelligence is not stored in memory. It's built in the act of understanding. Level 3, procedural understanding, knowing how. At level 3, something important changes. You are no longer just repeating words or definitions. You can do things. You know the steps. You can follow a method from start to finish and reliably get an answer. This is where intelligence becomes useful in a practical sense. Engineers, technicians, programmers, accountants, surgeons, many people operate at this level every day, and society absolutely depends on it. If you want a bridge that doesn't fall down, or a computer that actually works, level 3 intelligence is essential. But there's still a subtle trap here. You can know how to do something without knowing why it works. Let me give you a simple analogy. Imagine you know how to drive a car very well. You can steer, brake, accelerate, park, and navigate traffic smoothly. But if the engine makes a strange noise and stops, you have no idea what's wrong. You know how to operate the system, but not how the system works. That's level 3 intelligence. And again, there's nothing wrong with it. The trouble comes when we confuse competence with comprehension. Here's a short story. I've seen people who could solve a particular type of problem perfectly, as long as it looked exactly like the problems they had practiced. Change one assumption, rephrase the question, or alter the context slightly, and suddenly they're lost. They weren't stupid. They were skilled, but their understanding was brittle. They knew the procedure, not the principle. This level feels very satisfying because it gives you control. You can produce results. You can fix things. You can get the right answer on demand. And that success can create a quiet confidence that says, I understand this. But now let's try a thought experiment. Suppose your usual method suddenly stops working. The steps lead to nonsense. The answer looks wrong. What do you do next? If all you can say is, that's the method, so it must be right, then the method has replaced thinking. Real understanding begins when you're willing to question the procedure itself. At level 3, intelligence is still mostly external. It lives in instructions, manuals, examples, and habits. You are executing knowledge that was packaged by someone else. The next level, the truly dangerous one for your ego, is where you start opening the package and asking what's inside. So here's the reflective question I want you to sit with. If your usual method failed tomorrow, could you figure out why, or would you only know that it failed? Knowing how is powerful. Knowing why is transformative. And the difference between the two is where learning really starts. Level 4, conceptual understanding, knowing why. At level 4, intelligence takes a decisive turn inward. This is where you stop relying entirely on procedures and begin to understand the structure underneath them. You don't just know what to do, you know why it works, and that changes everything. Conceptual understanding means you can see the skeleton beneath the skin. You understand principles, not just steps. You can take an idea apart and put it back together again. And most importantly, you can notice when something doesn't make sense, even if it looks familiar. Let me give you an analogy. Imagine learning to play chess. At first, you memorize opening moves. Then you learn tactics, forks, pins, sacrifices. But at level 4, you start to understand position. You see why certain moves are strong, why others are weak, and how the entire board fits together as a system. You're no longer following recipes. You're thinking. Here's a short story that captures this well. When I was learning physics seriously, I noticed something interesting. Once I truly understood a concept, I could forget the equation. If I needed it later, I could rebuild it from basic ideas. The equation was no longer sacred. It was just a shorthand. That's a good test. If the formula vanished, would the idea survive? At level 4, the answer is yes. Now for a thought experiment. Suppose you're explaining a concept to someone who keeps asking why. Not to be annoying, but genuinely curious. Why does that happen? Why does that rule exist? Why does this assumption matter? If you can keep answering without eventually saying, because that's just how it is, you're probably operating at this level. This is also where false confidence starts to crack. At earlier levels, confidence comes from familiarity or success. At level 4, confidence becomes quieter. You begin to see how interconnected ideas are and how easy it is to misunderstand them. You start catching yourself before saying, I know this, and replacing it with, I think this works because. That's intellectual honesty growing. But there's a danger here too. Once people reach conceptual understanding, they sometimes stop asking questions. They think they've arrived. They mistake clarity for completeness. That's a mistake. Understanding why something works does not mean you understand everything it touches. Reality is larger than any explanation. So here's the reflective question I want to leave you with. If someone challenged your explanation, could you defend it using basic principles, or would you retreat to authority and formulas? Conceptual understanding isn't about having the final answer. It's about having a foundation strong enough to stand on while you keep asking better questions. And that's where intelligence starts to feel less like possession and more like participation. Level 5, transfer, connection, and generalization. At level 5, intelligence becomes mobile. Up to this point, understanding often stays where it was learned. Physics stays in physics. Psychology stays in psychology. Work stays at work. But at level 5, ideas start to travel. You recognize patterns across different domains and carry insight from one place into another. This is not about knowing more facts. It's about seeing similar structures hiding inside different stories. A simple explanation is this. You no longer ask only, how does this work? You start asking, what is this like? That question, what is this like, is the engine of deep intelligence. Here's a real-world analogy. Imagine you learn how feedback works in electronics. Later, you notice the same idea in biology, homeostasis. Then in economics, market corrections. Then in relationships, arguments that spiral when feedback goes wrong. Different systems, same pattern. You're no longer memorizing separate facts. You're building a mental map. Let me offer a short story. I once noticed that students who truly understood physics could explain it using examples from music, cooking, or everyday motion. They didn't need the classroom to think clearly. The ideas had become portable. That portability is the mark of level 5. Now a thought experiment. Suppose you learn a new idea today, any idea at all. Ask yourself, where else might this apply? If the answer is nowhere, you may not have understood it deeply yet. But if you start seeing echoes, connections to things you already know, you're operating at this level. This is also where creativity lives. Artists, inventors, and good teachers often live here. They see bridges where others see walls. They don't respect subject boundaries because reality doesn't respect them either. But there is a danger at level 5. Pattern seeking can become pattern forcing. You can start seeing similarities that aren't really there. You can become too confident in analogies and forget to check details. False confidence at this level sounds like it's basically the same thing. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it absolutely isn't. So intellectual honesty becomes even more important. You must constantly ask, is this a real connection or just a clever story? That question keeps intelligence healthy. So here is the reflective question I want you to sit with. When you learn something new, do you try to connect it to other things you know, or do you keep knowledge in isolated compartments? Because intelligence at this level isn't about brilliance. It's about integration. And the more connections you build, the more the world starts to feel understandable, not simpler, but richer. That richness is not the end of learning. It's the beginning of wisdom. Level 6, meta-understanding, thinking about how you think. At level 6, intelligence turns inward. This is the level where you stop asking only what you know or why something works, and you begin asking a more uncomfortable question. How did I come to believe this? Meta-understanding means understanding your own understanding. You become aware of your assumptions, your habits of thought, your blind spots, and, most importantly, your tendency to fool yourself. And believe me, fooling yourself is the easiest thing in the world. A simple explanation of level 6 is this. You are no longer just solving problems, you are examining the tools you use to solve them. Let me give you a real-world analogy. Imagine you're using a map to navigate a city. At earlier levels, you focus on the streets and landmarks. At level 6, you start asking whether the map itself is accurate, up-to-date, or missing entire neighborhoods. You realize the map is not the territory, and neither is your mind. Here's a short story. I once watched a group of very smart people argue fiercely about a problem. They all used impressive language. They all cited authorities. And they all missed the same assumption, an assumption so basic that none of them thought to question it. What struck me wasn't their intelligence. It was how invisible their thinking process was to them. At level 6, intelligence includes the ability to notice how certainty forms. You start catching yourself saying things like, I feel sure about this, but what evidence would change my mind? That question is a gift. Now, let's try a thought experiment. Think of a belief you hold strongly. It doesn't matter what it's about, science, politics, relationships, yourself. Now ask, where did this belief come from? What experiences reinforced it? What evidence would make me doubt it? If you can't answer the last question, that belief may be running on momentum rather than understanding. This level is uncomfortable because it undermines ego. You can no longer hide behind expertise or success. You become aware that being clever does not make you immune to error. In fact, it can make you more vulnerable. False confidence at this level sounds like, "I've thought about this very deeply, so I must be right." True intelligence says, "I've thought about this deeply, so I know how fragile my thinking can be." That humility is not weakness, it's precision. So here's the reflective question I want you to consider. When you feel most certain, do you pause to examine why? Or do you rush to defend the certainty itself? At level 6, intelligence stops being about winning arguments or reaching conclusions. It becomes about maintaining intellectual hygiene, constantly cleaning your thinking, checking your tools, and staying alert to self-deception. And strangely enough, that makes learning not heavier, but lighter. Because you no longer need to be right. You only need to be honest. Level 7, intellectual humility and lifelong curiosity. If the earlier levels feel like building tools, level 7 is about learning how to live with them. This is not the highest level in the sense of prestige or rank. In fact, it's the level least interested in ranking at all. Here, intelligence stops being about what you know and becomes about how you relate to what you don't know. A simple explanation is this. At level 7, you are comfortable standing in uncertainty without rushing to fill it with noise. You don't mistake confidence for truth. You don't feel threatened by unanswered questions. And you don't need to appear smart in order to keep learning. Let me give you a real-world analogy. Imagine walking into a vast library where most of the books are written in languages you can't read yet. At earlier levels, this might feel intimidating or frustrating. At level 7, it feels exhilarating. Every unread book represents possibility, not failure. Ignorance, at this level, is not a flaw. It's an invitation. Here's a short story. The most impressive thinkers I've ever met shared one quality. They were quick to say, "I don't know," not as a defense, not as humility theater, but as a precise statement. They knew exactly where their understanding ended, and they were delighted by that boundary. They treated ignorance the way an explorer treats an unmapped region, not as embarrassment, as opportunity. Now for a thought experiment. Imagine you're in a conversation where you don't understand what's being discussed. At earlier levels, you might nod along, change the subject, or reach for impressive words. At level 7, you do something radical. You ask a genuine question, not to trap, not to impress, but to understand. That question might feel vulnerable. It might expose a gap in your knowledge, but it also opens the door to real learning. False confidence cannot survive here. At this level, pretending to know feels exhausting and pointless. You've learned that intelligence grows fastest when ego gets out of the way. And something interesting happens. Curiosity becomes self-sustaining. You no longer learn to pass tests, win arguments, or secure status. You learn because understanding reality, even imperfectly, is deeply satisfying. So here's the reflective question I want to leave you with. When was the last time you changed your mind? Not because you were forced to, but because you discovered something new and exciting. That moment, that quiet internal shift, is what level 7 intelligence feels like. Not loud, not flashy, but alive. If there's a secret to intelligence worth keeping, it's this. The joy of learning does not come from arriving. It comes from traveling, question by question, mistake by mistake, through a universe that is far more interesting than any story we could tell ourselves about how smart we are. And that journey, thankfully, never ends.